My name is Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University, and I'd like to welcome you to Books and Strikes. Books and Strikes, as you can see, is a show where we usually discuss books on baseball, although we have brought in other people from other sports and also from baseball. But today we are talking about a book called The St. Louis Browns, the story of a beloved team. It has three authors, Bill Borst, Bill Rogers, and Ed Wheatley. Ed is with us here today. They are all associated with the St. Louis Browns Historical Society. Now, we had done, if you're this interested in this show and this book, we did a previous show on this, so that there's actually two shows addressing the St. Louis Browns, and its history is quite fantastic. And I just wanted to jump into one example, and then we'll get into things. I'm looking at the year 1910. You've got a manager by the name of Jack O'Connor.
Peach pie.
And he is going to help out Napoleon Lajoie to try to win the batting crown title that year against Ty Cobb. And so the idea was that they had to get Napoleon's batting average a bit higher so that he'd win it on that last day of the year. Otherwise, Ty Cobb wins the car. And so what he does is he takes the third baseman and he moves him back to left field so that old Napoleon can lay down 7 bunts and easily make it to first base. And so he ends up doing this, but he still loses the batting ground, and I thought that was interesting. They went over to the woman that was the official scorekeeper, and they tried to bribe her to change an error into a hit. And so, as a result, Ty Cobb still wins the batting crown, and the difference is .000974%. We're talking an incredibly small difference. But in 1981, it was found out that Cobb should have lost the title because what happened was Detroit had helped him by actually taking one of his games and counting it twice.
Right. I mean, what happened in those old days of baseball, there were no computers, it was all written word and things. There was such competition, there was such pride on the part of Ty Cobb, who was just the preeminent hitter of his day and had continued the string of winning batting averages. Napoleon Lajoie, having played with the Indians, was equal up there as far as hitting. People had such a disgust and dislike of Ty Cobb for many reasons, just his manner, the way he played the game, his sometimes racial attitudes. He was just an honorary man, and people had hard feelings toward him. So the Browns, on that last day, Lajoie comes to town, and the Browns, like you said, Peach Pie O'Connor, Jack O'Connor, the manager of the Browns, orders the third baseman to play out on the grass so Lajoie could just keep bunting and getting on. And, this is like, you never really hear about this controversy like you do the Black Sox.
Yep.
And the thing of it is O'Connor and a couple of the coaches were banned from baseball besides doing this and, as you spoke, trying to bribe the scorekeeper. I mean, the bribe was like, get her a new dress outfit, but they actually were banned for baseball for life. And you just don't hear that. You hear a shoeless Joe Jackson and the whole White Sox scandal, but there were a lot of scandals just of this type of magnitude in the game.
When you go through the book, point I brought up, I think, in the previous show that we were addressing on this, is it's sort of like the Browns from when their inception, so 1902 to more or less 1922, where they miss it by one game, winning the pennant. But then after that, you're looking more at a declining period. And I thought this was, and I was wondering about this, 1925, they're changing the dimensions of Sportsman's Park. And so originally you ended up having left field was 315 feet. Now they move it back to 340 feet. And then right field, you go from 320 to 355. So obviously this had to have some impact on changing the batting averages and the home runs.
Well, it did. I mean, I think a couple of the things, in those periods as you speak of, pre-late 20s, there was the dead ball
Yeah.
era, is
Right.
what it's phenomenally called in the world of baseball. But it was also, they had the coffee ball, the spit ball, all these different types of pitches that were outlawed, that pitchers would throw legitimately prior to that time. So the ball carried more. They had better abilities technologically to make balls. In those days, you just kept the same ball in there. Today, it's every pitch the ball's basically thrown out. So you could play all 9 innings with the same ball. So and that's why it's called the dead ball era. And these pitchers could, like a spit ball, coffee ball, shine ball. You name all the different type of tricks they did. That was all legal. Then it was eventually banned. So the hitters did get some more proactive abilities there at the plate. And plus, it was also that time that Babe Ruth stepped in and changed the world and made it more about the home run.
Yeah.
What was interesting, you speak, for those in the audience who can remember old Sportsman's Park, it did get deep out there in left field. But, the one thing about Sportsman's Park, the right field had a pavilion across it. And for many years, there was a screen there, and there was not a screen there. So, that's why Stan Musial was such a tremendous doubles hitter, and he only wound up with 475 home runs because they had a screen there most of the time during his era. Earlier, it wasn't there, and then as we get later on, and Bill Veeck and all his shenanigans, he tried to do what many said, and actually was proven later than the '87 World Series when the Twins would turn on the blowers in the Humphrey Dome when the Twin players were batting and turn it off when the Cardinals were batting. He was trying to raise the screen when the Browns were in the field and lower the screen when the Browns were at bat, all across the pavilion in right field. But
You talked about the fans, and there's a brief sort of contrast. They called them the rooters or the pennant rooters. And it was interesting, you were saying there was a distinction between the Browns fans as part of the rooters versus the Cardinals fans.
Yeah, we've tried to do analytics and, going back where you're from in New York, was it the Yankees, the white collar, the Dodgers or the Giants, the blue collar, and, how was that in St. Louis? Yeah. And some of it was a kind of a white collar, blue collar. Some of it is simply like who were the winners and who were the losers. And, the lovable Browns as they became after that tide in the late 20s and what changed their history.
So the decline seems to begin after 1922. So you're talking about sort of 1923 to 1926, and as a result, in that period, you start seeing the decline of the Browns.
Well, you do. It's some of it is the aging of all the great players that we spoke about on the previous show, where you had Baby Doll Jacobson, Kenny Williams, who had won a batting home run title. You had the 3 outfielders that 5 years over 300. George Sister. They started aging. Probably the most critical thing that happened was Philip DeCatsby Ball, the owner, died suddenly.
Yeah.
And he had invested and built this big team. Well, when he died, it was the club was put under the tutelage of a law firm who was working his estate. And, being lawyers who didn't know anything about baseball, they made some very bad moves. Again, trying to protect the estate. They weren't investing. And that really started taking them down. And it was also then when the Depression hit and attendance was impacted. Revenue goes down as attendance goes down. And, it then starts a kind of a cyclical pattern. As you're short on revenue, you get a good player, you'll sell them to get money, and then, generally they're backfilled with not as great of a player. So there was this kind of spiral situation that started happening to the Browns. And then, shortly after the Depression comes World War II, and how players then got pulled into service.
Interesting. Yeah, you had a nice little vignette I liked. The Browns and the Yankees play a doubleheader September 26, 1926. The 2 games collectively took 2 hours and 7 minutes.
I mean, that is how baseball was played. And the thing about those 2 games, if you'll recall, they were not like 1-0 games. They were like 4-1 or 6-4. They were games in which there was scoring and there were men on base. That's how baseball. If you go back and you look at the statistics, the 2 things that jump at me the most are, 1, the time of the games. I mean, that's what all baseball is talking about today. How do you make it quicker? The other thing is, you go look at a box score, and pitchers pitch 9 innings. Pitchers, how many games, and there's a couple really key games in the Browns' history that we highlight in the book, would go 12 innings, even in a loss. Even the last game the Browns played was an 11-inning affair, and the pitcher went the whole game. We didn't have all these changing pitchers.
Is there a legacy of things around St. Louis? Now, Heine Miney is a pitcher with the Browns, and there is a Heine Miney baseball field. In fact, it's one of the fields we
all play on. Yeah.
Are there other still things around St. Louis that sort of reflect some of the Browns' history?
Well, I think, in Heine Miney, we always joke when we have Browns events, how many people know who I pull up a picture of the 1922, one of the greatest Browns teams of all, and there's Heine Miney who's a pitcher. His fame was more in Pittsburgh as a pitcher, but he owned a tavern right there on Lee May Ferry Road, and he maintained this beautiful field behind it, and like you said, we still play it in our senior leagues. There aren't that many memories. I will say the DeWitt family, and we haven't talked about them because we've talked about this changing of ownership.
Yeah.
The DeWitts, Bill DeWitt Sr. was a longtime executive general manager for the Browns. He was a protege of Branch Rickey with the Cardinals, and he told him to go over, you can move up and do better with the Browns. So he took over as an executive, became general manager. He was the first man to be general manager of the year in both leagues. He won the American League General Manager of the Year in 1944 with the Browns, and in 1961 he won it with the Cincinnati Reds in the National League. And he actually, then he and his brother Charlie bought the Browns in the late 40s and owned them for 3 years. And so, there is this legacy tied to the Browns through the DeWitt family. They are very, very great supporters of us. They help us. They're part of our historical society. Bill Sr., Bill Jr. and Bill III. We all remember the story again under Bill Veck's shenanigans of Eddie Goodell,
right.
The 3'7" little guy who came to bat as a pinch hitter. It was Bill DeWitt Jr.'s uniform, because he was the bat boy that he wore that day when Goodell came to bat, and it's down in the Hall of Fame, and you'll see it in the book where Mr. DeWitt took it out for us, and made sure I got copies of it properly in the book. And the other thing that is probably one of the most memorable pieces of Brown's legacy is the statue of Louis IX in front of Art Hill, because for most of the time that was the logo of the St. Louis Browns. And it was King Louis on that statue, and then there was a crest. And the DeWitt and Donald Barnes, the owner at the time, they had a contest, and they picked that logo. And I always tell everybody when I'm talking about the Browns, and I show that logo, it is the most iconic logo to me in baseball. I mean, everybody knows the NY or the Yankees, or even when it was the Giants or anything. But the uniqueness of that logo is that you have King Louis IX on the horse, the steed, and then in the shield there's 8 stars representing the 8 teams in the American League, and there's 9 bars representing the 9 players on the field. So when you look at, to me that was kind of the perfect logo, because that statue was also the symbol of St. Louis to everyone, basically from the time of the World's Fair in 1904 until the mid-'60s when the arch became the symbol. But if you go back in any of that time, the symbol for St. Louis was that Louis IX statue.
But then the symbol for the Browns becomes that little alien.
Yeah, alien's a good term. It's kind of like St. Louis U, Billiken. I mean, it's this elf. Yeah. Bill Veck came to town. Now, and that's an interesting story, how when Bill Veck came to St. Louis, and we talk about in the first film, this competition between the Cardinals and the Browns. Veck had owned the Indians, and in 1948 had taken the Indians to the World Series. And with some financial issues, he had to sell. He looked around and he saw this perfect storm evolving in St. Louis. He saw the Cardinals without a stadium because they were tenants of the Browns at Sportsman's Park. And there had been many times and rumors that the Cardinals were going to move. There was a situation in the late 40s that they may move to Detroit, but there was always a target to move the Cardinals to Houston. And the owner of the Cardinals at this time in the late 40s, going into the 50s, was Fred Sy, who was in very significant trouble with the IRS, and it looked like he was going to jail. And so the Cardinals were in this situation of a perfect storm. So Bill Veeck comes in and says, I am going to make the Browns the king of St. Louis. We'll get rid of the Cardinals. I just won't let them lease my stadium. Their owner's going to jail. They'll just find some new ownership and move. And he tried everything he could to attract fans into Sportsman's Park when he didn't have the best players. And I call him in the book the P.T. Barnum of baseball. He created circus acts at times. I mean, you could go to the Browns game and see the Harlem Globetrotters play a game in the outfield. You could watch a circus act along the sidelines prior to and after a game. So he was trying to attract people. He sent letters and passes to every child born in St. Louis at the hospital saying, here's a pass, we thank you, we want to make you a Brownie. And he would, if you were a boy, you also got a contract to show up 18 years later for a tryout in spring training. So he did everything. He'd walk around the stadiums. He actually moved into Sportsman's Park and lived in an apartment there. He wanted this to happen, but he just didn't have a good enough team. And he did things. We spoke of Eddie Goodell, a pinch hitter.
I like the one where he allowed the fans to be a manager one day, and they won the game.
They did. By luck, they won the game. It was called Grandstand Manager Night. He set a section up in Sportsman's Park, and if you had a pass, you sat in a section, and they had a field attendant out there with questions. And all the people in the stands had these yes or no placards. Zach Taylor, the Browns manager, was sitting on the roof of the Browns dugout in a rocking chair, and he really wasn't out of the game. So I always use the classic example of Hank Arf, who's a local St. Louis, and his family still owns Schrader Funeral Home out in Baldwin. Hank Arf was a big lumberjack first baseman of that era, big muscles and, could clobber the ball like crazy. But he was a very slow runner. Well, they're playing the Philadelphia Athletics. Hank walks. Up goes the sign, should he steal? The Athletics are all watching the stands. Everybody says yes. And by what Veeck had told these guys was, if they say run, Hank, you got to run. Well, Hank, like I said, he was very, very slow, and he's thrown out by 25 feet. And as you did say, that through all those shenanigans that day, the Browns did win. But it was those things because 5 days earlier, he had the Eddie Goodell incident. Yeah. 3'7" pinch hitter. He does this. Baseball turned on Bill Veeck. And so, he was just trying to entertain. He was trying to make things happen. And it's kind of like, is he a good guy or a bad guy? I mean, he's trying everything, but maybe he's not doing it right. But baseball really turned against him and actually forced him to sell the Browns.
And it seems like that was the reason they didn't move for the 53 season to Baltimore. Correct. Because, again, he had to unload the team, so that's why it's the 54 season they begin as the Orioles.
Yeah, because baseball said, he decided, because two things happened. One, as I spoke, Fred Sy's in trouble as the owner of the Cardinals, and everybody's thinking he's leaving town. Except there's a guy down a few blocks away who makes beer, thinks, I can sell a lot of beer by having a baseball team, and that's Augie Busch. And Augie Busch comes in and buys the Cardinals in 53. And all of a sudden, Veeck is like, I can't compete and win against Augie Busch in this town. And
on the Busch, on your book, there's a few other things I want to go through.
Yeah.
People that opened up to you. That you don't really discuss in the book because it's focused only on the Browns, but you're meeting family members, and they're letting you see letters and pictures and artifacts.
Well, I mean, there's two things. What I wanted the book to be is not just a lot of words. So we put in about 300 vignettes, small little stories. Some of them we then went and found memorabilia to the stories, or the memorabilia became the story. Like Dizzy Dean coming out of the broadcast booth to pitch 6 years after he pitched in the major leagues, and all of a sudden I got a scorecard from that game. I got a ticket stub from that game, a Dizzy Dean autographed baseball. people, once we heard, because there had never been a book like this, and the book has about 700 pictures that tie of memorabilia or players to this. And there's really not been a lot of books on the Browns, and once word got out, people would call and say, here's what I got. Can I help you? As part of the Historical Society, we have a lot of memorabilia from the players as they pass away. We've gone to the families and they've donated. We've got papers of the owners.
Kept somewhere?
Yeah, we have an office. It's not an open office. We do have multiple displays of our items across the St. Louis region. Some of it's in the Cardinal Hall of Fame. Some of it is in the St. Louis Sports Hall of Fame exhibits. We were, for many years, until just recently, in Scottrade, but with the renovation, we've moved those out, and there's a new place. They will soon be announced where that's going. And we've got, the History Museum, we've got displays, and we keep that. In the papers we keep in our office, and that's where, I was able to take telegrams of congratulations. You talk about a kid in a candy store where all of a sudden you're looking at paper from, Kennesaw Mountain Landis or Clark Griffith or Joe Cronin, or Tom Yawkey, or, it's the biggest names in baseball. And actually in America, all these, presidents sending letters and telegrams, and it's all there that we put in here. And I thought it was really important to show the memorabilia because as a baseball purist, I like seeing autographs or seeing these little bits, and that's why I wanted to be a coffee table book with lots of pictures, not just 2 inches of reading story. But it was people coming and saying, I've got this, can I help you? I've got these game-used bats of, Vern Stevens or all these players. Could I put those in your book for you? Can you use them? And they let us. And then subsequently to that, as we've had our book events at the libraries or even some of the bookstores, it's become like the Antiques Roadshow where people are bringing us items. I had a lady, I was doing an Oasis presentation in Clayton a month ago, and she goes, let me show you, this was my ticket from the 44 World Series, Game 3, here's where I sat. Or I've had guys bring in they had their little cards from Grandstand Manager Night, they got them in that section. And, the Cardinals and the Browns had these cards. The Cardinals had the Knothole Gang, and the Browns had the Brownie Brigade. And I had one gentleman, and you'll see all those pictures in the book of these cards. He came up to me at one of my talks and said, look at this. I've had this in my wallet since I was in the 7th grade, because that would get them in. You got to remember, these games were played generally at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Yeah. Kids would get off school, and with these passes, they could get into the games free, if they met the right criteria of doing good schoolwork and all that. And he'd been carrying it. Think about it. He's in his 80s, and he's had it in his wallet since the 7th grade. That's what this meaning, and these people are. I've got these scorecards. I got all these autographed balls in the days when players would just sign along, and they're bringing these out, and it's really not just those items. It's the memories that is amazing, and what we've touched, this like untapped remembrance.
There was a situation that sort of, in the book you talk about it, and so it indicated to me that years later there were very passionate Browns fans. You have a situation where Harlan Cliff is a Browns player who's going to be in an All-Star game, 1937. And Joe McCarthy of the Yankees is the manager of the American League team. And somewhere later, now I think it's in the early 1960s, he then mentions that people had written him more than 10,000 letters saying, why the hell didn't you put Cliff in the baseball game?
Well, I think a lot of it is just the passion of baseball in St. Louis, the respect for our St. Louis players. He was a popular, not a great guy, but he was a popular player, and he, just felt, jilted. It was the same thing in 1944. Here the Cardinals had been to the World Series in 42 and 43. Stan Musial has many times in interviews and in the newspaper would talk about, we went in that 44 World Series thinking, here we are. That's our 3rd trip to the World Series. We're the great Cardinal dynasty. Everybody loved the Browns those first games of the World Series. We were the underdogs in this series, and there was this bubbling passion of the Browns, and and their players.
Sort of interesting players are Johnny Bertardino.
Berardino, yes.
Berardino, who, now I remember this name. He goes on TV as Dr. Hardy on General Hospital from 1963 to 1996.
Yeah, until he got sick with cancer and died. But yeah, they always joke that the face insured for $1 million because when he was playing ball, he was the face, this movie star face, and I can remember growing up as a kid, my mother watching, those soap operas, and it was like, that guy played for the Browns. And he had this loyal following across the country, and people knew him as Mr. Brown.
It was a little, just couple of vignettes. Bobo Newsom, whose name I remember, but you called him one of the most despised men in baseball.
Just his demeanor. It was just interesting how people had, it was probably more of a folksy game, and you knew more about people, and he just had a demeanor that rubbed people the wrong way. Kind of like Ty Cobb back when we spoke earlier on the previous show, how people reacted to Ty Cobb.
We're not going to have a lot of time left, but they break the color barrier in 1947, same year that the Dodgers do with Jackie Robinson. They bring up Willard Brown, who now becomes known as a footnote. He's the first black player to hit a home run in the majors.
Yes.
He'll go on to the Hall of Fame because of playing in the Negro Leagues. And Henry Thompson, who I remember see play because he played with the New York Giants.
Correct. Hey?
And so here you have them both playing in a game together. It's the first time you're going to have two black players in the lineup in a game.
Yeah, the Browns were very innovative. And as I said, they were always looking for fans. Bill DeWitt Sr. and Muckerman, the owner, they felt, let's do something here to tap into this resource of African Americans in the city and bring them into the stands.
But it doesn't seem like it works.
Well, there's a couple reasons. First of all, two things real quick. They started, Jackie Robinson came in April. In July 5th, Larry Doby became the first Afro-American in the American League. A couple days later, Hank Thompson started for the Browns. And then 2 days later, Willard Brown joined him in the outfield, so they were the first to have two. And Hank Thompson, by the way, is the first to integrate two teams because he was the first Afro-American on the New York Giants. So he is the guy who integrates two teams. But they did not perform real well. Willard Brown was just, the Babe Ruth of the Caribbean and the Negro Leagues. And he just didn't have a good season. He felt the pressure. He left. He went down to the Caribbean and just hit 600, and I can't tell you how many home runs. But there was also the belief, and this comes from Buck O'Neill, that they were going to have to pay the Monarchs a lot more money if they kept him.
That's it. Very good book.
Well, thanks.
Okay. Thank you for joining us today.